Hi everybody, welcome to week 12, motor control and learning, final week. This week we're going to be focusing on the topic of talent development. So the theory we'll focus on is one called the athletic skills model. It's a framework that fits within dynamical systems theory's ecological psychology for looking at learning at the timescale of development. We'll look at constraints on talent development, and we'll end up on applications related to mitigating something called the relative age effect. These are the learning outcomes for this week. Please take a moment to go through them. And these are the three questions I want you to be thinking about as we go through the material this week. Firstly, question is, are Olympic gold medalists born, or are they made, or is it both? Second question is, if you want to be an expert, does it matter if or when you specialize? So, and why? And what I mean by specialize is when you start to devote all your attention and time on practicing the sport that you want to become an expert in. And the third question is, which is better, to train one sport or multiple sports, and why? So this athletic skills model is a theory that helps explain why early diversification in motor skills is an important aspect for developing motor skills into adulthood. So being able to participate effectively in physical activities and sports as we get older. It helps answer this practical question of how we best prepare individuals to participate in sport and to do this from an early age. And it relates most closely to findings that multi-sport backgrounds provide a foundation for sporting excellence and long-term participation in sport and physical activity. And this figure here of where we have sort of a coiled arrow versus just a straight line is meant to reflect that when we help develop people with an all-round multi-sport background, they have more capacity to grow and improve throughout their careers as movers. Whereas if we focus and specialize, there's a sort of a limited ceiling that we're placing on people. And that's the basic idea. So if we summarize the athletic skills model in just a series of sentences, we could say that it's a holistic framework for long-term skill development grounded in ecological psychology and dynamic systems theory. So these theories that we've worked on from weeks 9 through 11. In ASM, long-term skill development of elite athletes is promoted by what they call multilateral development. So this participation in a variety of sports during early stages of athletic development, followed by a broadening of the conditions of movement in a specific sport. So this is where we start to focus on a specific sport, but vary the conditions under which we're exposed to. So there'd be variability of practice. To develop expertise following the ASM, first we start with a child, where we aim to get them to become a motivated, versatile mover. Secondly, to have them develop into an athlete. Thirdly, as an athlete, begin to specialize into a sport. And finally, they become a specialist within the sport. And children, in a nutshell, can become multilateral movers by offering them varied and development-appropriate challenges on both physical and psychosocial levels. Okay, so to get a handle on this framework, we're going to go through these 5 concepts. Firstly, timescales of learning and development, motor development, measuring how we measure development, talent and athlete development, and finally, principles of the athletic skills model. So timescales of learning and development. So performance, learning, and development involve processes that occur at different timescales. Motor learning and development are both characterized by persistent change in behavior over time, and we can measure different indices of change in motor behavior at different timescales over which the change occurs. And this is what I mean by timescales. So we're familiar with performance timescales and learning timescales. With the performance timescale, we're talking about the timescale of behavior within a trial. So while the person's interacting with their environment to produce a performance or an action. And we're generally talking in terms of behavior as it unfolds in milliseconds and seconds. With the learning timescale, this is timescale where we're looking at change, relatively persistent change related to practice. Typically, we're talking about measuring in terms of minutes, hours, maybe even days, weeks, and months, depending on how long it takes for this persistent change due to practice to take effect. And finally, you've got the developmental timescale, and this involves change related to age, growth, maturation. It's generally measured in months and years. And performance, there's a relationship, of course, between development and performance and learning. And both performance and learning are generally dependent on the developmental state of the individual. So if they're young, adolescent, or an adult, the rate at which they learn things varies as a function of age. And talent and athlete development models, including the athletic skills model, conceptualize motor skills and expertise with respect to this timescale, this developmental timescale. And so advices around how to develop expertise take into account the development state of the individual. So motor development. So starting with this concept of development. Development's defined by several characteristics. So firstly, that there's it's a continual cumulative process of change in functional capacity. So we're talking about changes in our capability to live, move, and work. Do things in the real world. It's related, but it's not dependent on age. So as age increases, development proceeds. And various processes of change at different rates depending on the age of the person. And the reason why I say it's related but not dependent on age is because at different ages, developmental processes can proceed faster or slower. So when you're younger, you tend to gain height quicker than when you're an adult. And also, people can be the same chronological age but have different biological ages. So they might be more or less mature, for example. And also, another important point is that individuals differ. And that relates to this point that individuals differ in terms of their rates of development. The final point around development is it tends to involve a sequential change. There's a predictable pattern of development that we can identify in humans. And the figure that I've presented here on the left is Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. The point is that it shows how we have different factors related, the individual interacts with as they develop, that influences their development, and includes things such as their family, their school, their neighborhood, so this microsystem. It then gets extended out to extended family, community health services, the friends, neighborhoods, all the way out to this macrosystem level of the attitudes, values, beliefs, customs, laws of the society in general. So the point of the figure is to show that development is a complex concept. There's a lot of different factors working in different, very complicated or complex ways. And so these need to be taken into account when we try to understand what factors influence development. Okay, so talking about motor development, this refers to continuous age-related change as well as interacting constraints in the individual, the environment, and the tasks that drive these movement-related changes. As a field, it's a field of research that studies developmental change in movement and factors that underlie those changes. So factors such as family, culture, etc. And it's treated as a discipline, it's treated distinct from motor control and learning. And that's not to say that it doesn't influence control and learning. And certainly both of these are dependent on the developmental state of the individual. And also motor learning and control, people's experience, also influence developmental processes. So how do we measure motor development? Because it occurs at long timescales, it involves different sorts of research methods than what we've been dealing with so far. So I'm going to go through briefly some of the key ones. So research in motor development looks at asking questions such as what was the behavior or motor skill like before a given measurement and why? And it could also ask things such as how will the current behavior change in the future, and why might that be? And to answer these sorts of questions, there are different designs: longitudinal, cross-sectional, mixed, and also retrospective designs. Longitudinal study design, this is where we have an individual or groups observed as they change with age for over a given period of time. And one of the problems, of course, with this approach is that if you follow an individual, let's say you take a cohort of people born in the year 2000 and you make measurements of these individuals 2005, 2010, 2015, and so on, at some point, depending on how long you're observing people over, will influence how long it takes you to get answers to the questions that you have. So to get around this, researchers can use cross-sectional designs. So this is where individuals, groups selected at different points in the age span. So maybe you get a cohort of people born in year 2000 versus people born in 1995. And if you were to measure them in 2005, you've got one cohort of 5-year-olds and a second cohort of 10-year-olds. And you're making observations on these two groups as if and assuming that the behavior they reflect would be the same as what you would see if you were to observe one cohort in 2005 and that same cohort in 2010. So this is a cross-sectional design where you make that assumption. This can be problematic, of course, because you're assuming that that what you see in the group here who's age 10 in this cross-sectional design is the same as what you would see if you followed the same group, followed people over time. And one of the problems there is that things change over time. So other factors that are important change. So technology changes, for example. And so the way in which a 10-year-old would learn 5 years later might be quite different because of interaction effects with these other factors going on that you're not able to take into account when you use a cross-sectional design. And this is one of the reasons why people use sequential mixed designs. It's where you have several cohorts that are followed over a period of time where you're able to see what the impact is, whether or not you have cohort effects. And it allows you to observe longer timescales depending on the number of cohorts that you have and the length of time that you observe people over. The final type of technique that I'll talk about is called a retrospective study design. This is a study design where you take a cohort of individuals with a shared set of characteristics, and then you compare them to another cohort, and to try to understand and to look into their history, to understand what distinguishes those characteristics. So, for example, you might get one group who are a super elite level sport performers, and another group who achieve a sub-elite level of sport performance. And you want to know what factors, such as in their past, that might predict or cause that level of skill. So maybe you ask them questions about how much time they spend practicing, the nature of their family support, their date of birth, etc. And this is a study that I'll use as an example throughout the lecture that exemplifies a retrospective design. And so in this study, it's made up of 32 former GB athletes from Great Britain. Coming from 7 different Olympic sports. 16 were considered super elite athletes who had won at least 1 gold medal at a world championship or Olympic game level, and at least 1 other medal at a different world championship or Olympic games. So they're multi-medal winners. The other athletes had won at least 1 medal at a significant international competition, such as a World Cup, Commonwealth Games, European Championship, but not a gold medal at a World Championship or Olympic Games. So they're considered elite athletes, not super elite. Data collection involves a mixture of quantitative, qualitative data, and data was cross-referenced with coaches and parents to try to validate the data, and they analysed using primarily a mixture of qualitative, quantitative analysis. And I'll just looking briefly at some of the data already from that study, some very typical sorts of results that you might expect from a study like this, where they look at the practice history of the athletes. So this relates all the way back to week 1, where we learn about deliberate practice, Erikson's model of deliberate practice, where the idea is it takes roughly 10,000 hours of practice in a particular context in order to achieve a high level of performance. So what the researchers have done here is they've looked at the point at which these athletes have started to train in this particular sport, and then asked them questions about how much time they spent practicing over that period of time. And what they're showing is, these elite, super elite, not that well differentiated based on these data, but they both certainly accumulate huge amounts of practice over 15 years of being involved in these sports. One of the interesting findings from the paper was to look into the type of practice people were doing. So it seemed to suggest that the super elite athletes were spending, they were spending significantly more time practicing in their main sport, but they also spent more time in other sports, different sports, as well as physical activities. And so that was an interesting finding. And I'll just want to make this distinction now, because I'll come back to it later, about the distinction between deliberate play. And it seems that super elite athletes spend more time in playful activities in other sports. It's not a huge amount compared to their main sport. And the fundamental difference between practice and play is the goal of the activity that the activity aims to achieve. So when we're talking about deliberate practice or practice activities, these are activities that aim to improve performance, whereas the goal of play is to have fun. So talent and athlete development. Why is this an interesting thing for us to spend time learning about? So it's because motor learning opportunities from a young age and throughout the lifespan have an impact on our behaviour and skill later on. And as a starting point, research is starting to show that 21st century kids are moving less. I'm sort of doing a bit of a play on words here with this pandemic, but there's certainly, you could say there's a pandemic of inactivity in youth. It'll be interesting to see what the impact is of the pandemic on physical activity levels. And research is starting to show that children are significantly less fit than they were 30 or more years ago. And in part, people think that it's because, or it's related to changes in technology and the way this shapes the way in which we spend our time. And this is a problem because as kids experience less movement challenges, this can cause and relate to various lifestyle-related diseases such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease. And on the other hand, children who have experienced sport movement activities tend to attain better academic results. They're more socially active, happier, tend to participate in physical activities and sports as an adult, which again protect them from these lifestyle-related diseases. So let's start with defining this concept of talent and athlete development. So what is talent? There are different definitions out there about what talent is, and it's influenced by the theoretical framework used. But in general, it refers to the degree of an individual's potential to improve and succeed in a particular sport. So by way of a broad definition, in the context of high-performance sport and athlete development, talent refers to potential for success at some future level of competition. So adult success that you might predict in a child. So in very simple terms, it might be that you're arguing that something like a person's current height is going to be a predictor at how good they're going to be when they're an adult. And this idea, or this term talent identification, is the process of recognizing individuals within a defined population. Imagine maybe under 12 soccer players, and where you predict that they have a potential to become elite athletes. And and I raise it immediately, talent identification is not reliable. And we know this because it's less and less accurate or reliable the earlier you try to make the prediction. So if you try to make predictions about where a child will end up in 10 years' time, this will be less accurate than if you try to make a prediction about somebody where they're going to end up in 5 years' time. And there's a lot of reasons, there's various reasons why it's not a reliable technique, at least with current technology and current knowledge. So one is that there's unpredictability in maturation. So there's genetically determined factors which cannot be predicted. Genes and environmental constraints influence performance, and these become increasingly unpredictable what's going to happen as time accumulates. And finally, measures that are used to predict whether or not someone will be good can also be and are often shown to be invalid and potentially open to bias. And I guess the one way to consider or imagine why talent identification is not something to put all your faith into, and certainly the research doesn't put a huge amount of faith in talent identification, although certainly it tries to understand it. It's similar to, because of the complex nature of development, the complex nature of development and also skills development, it's almost like trying to predict the weather. So if you were to forecast a weather system, you might be accurate a few months maximum in advance if you're lucky. But as you go further and further in time, the nature of the system is your ability to predict further in time starts to break down. So the closer in time an individual is identified, the better the likelihood that you actually are going to be correct with that they will perform and they can perform at a particular level. At some point, this then becomes called what we call talent selection, or selection. So you're selecting people for a team for a performance that's up and coming. And the reason I bring this up is because when we look at or conceptualize sport, and in elite sport contexts, typically pathways, we talk about pathways of development or developmental pathways. And there's a distinction to be made between talent pathways and performance pathways. So talent pathways is when you're working with younger individuals and you're trying to develop this group of participants or sport participants to eventually maybe transition into a performance pathway. So a team where the emphasis is no longer about the development of the individual, but it's about achieving gold medal or high competitive performance. So one of the important roles of talent identification then is to facilitate participation in these pathways. So given a person's current level of capability, people who identify talents, really what they're doing is trying to include individuals into pathways depending on their current capabilities. And so there's a de-emphasis on the prediction of future success, and because of this concept that it's something that we're not very good at least not yet. And there have been different models proposed to try to conceptualize talent development. And one of the reasons for this is because it's been shown to be something that is inherently variable. So this has been led by findings that there are multiple ways in which people achieve move through pathways. So one model might suggest that you go through a predictable sequential progression from, for example, if you were to enter a pathway at a senior level and then progress linearly all the way to the top, versus a mixed descent where you start as a junior and as you age and improve, you then transition into senior level competition and then achieve elite level performance, versus other processes or ways of ascending as well, where you might ascend to the top and then regress and then go back up again, and etc. And it shows, if anything, that linear progression is something that is not common to it's just one of the ways in which people achieve elite level performance. And so finding ways to understand how to promote talent development has led to more complex models, more complex than what you would see in terms of a traditional pyramid type approach. And this is an example of one of those where instead of going from you enter a sport and then you specialize and devote all of your time practicing in that sport with the outcome of maybe becoming an elite athlete or dropping out, there are other ways in which you can develop elite levels of performance. So rather than entering and specializing early, so early specialization refers to when you, at a young age, for example, under 12 years old, you start to constantly, at an intense level, devote your time to a single sport at the exclusion of all other sports. You instead of doing this, you sample a variety of other sports. So this would be something more akin to what we would call a multi-sport and or donor sport approach. So this multi-sport refers to when you play and sample many other sports with basic movement skills that are not necessarily present in this target sport or the sport that you end up in. And donor sports are sports and activities that are selected in order to, or that contribute directly and have a high similarity or overlap with the chosen sport that you end up performing in. And of course, there's this final pathway where people just recreationally participate in and don't end up in the elite pathway. And one of the interesting things about these different ways in which you might achieve elite levels of performance is that they're also associated with different psychosocial outcomes. So with early specialization, this has been associated with burnout, dropout, injury, and other negative outcomes, whereas approaches which are more diversified, involving sampling and or multi-sport involvement, generally related to more to better psychosocial outcomes. Okay, so the athletic skills model. So talent and athlete development models typically involve age-adapted training, and the athletic skills model is much the same, but it's different in the sense that it's highly integrated. So it integrates both considerations about developing motor skills as well as considerations around developing the athleticism of the individual. So devoting time to improving things like agility or endurance or strength and conditioning in combination with motor learning or motor skills. So talent development, again, traditionally it's been viewed as this pyramid process, ever improving performance in a given sport with accumulation of practice. So it follows that Erikson's deliberate practice model. With athlete development, this is where athletic capabilities such as strength, agility, flexibility are improved also with respect to the individual's development state. Athletic skills model, both of these are trained in combination in an age-appropriate manner. And I've posted Professor Geert Savelsberg. He's a professor at the Free University in Amsterdam. He's done a lot of work and developed this framework alongside other practitioners in the Netherlands. So it's very much a combination of theory and practice, this framework. And essentially the framework, again, it addresses and relates to different time points in an individual's development, and it involves these 5 different time points. So working with basic athletic skills from ages 6 to 9, advanced athletic skills from age 10 to 12, transition 13 to 14 years of old, performance athletic skills 15 to 18, and elite athletic skills 19 to 24 years old. And as a general progression, it argues that learners should devote attention to both motor skill and athletic capabilities. The child first, they argue, needs to become a versatile good mover, where they enjoy participating in sport and physical activity. They will then subsequently develop into an athlete with a range of physical capabilities. Once they've achieved this athlete status, and with a high degree of functional movement or movement capabilities, the child starts to specialize into a sport, and finally devotes attention to mastering or becoming a specialist within the sport. Okay, so that's all of the main ideas for the theoretical part of the lecture. We just take 5 minutes now to reflect on this question. Are Olympic gold medalists born, or are they made, or is it both? So take 5 minutes to think about that, and I'll see you in a bit. Okay, welcome to part B of week 12, motor learning and control. We're now going to get into some of the constraints on talent development. First constraint I'll talk about is the individual constraints, and in particular, as a starting point, is to talk about the way the brain changes with development and ways in which we need to adapt motor learning and athlete development practices accordingly. So skill develops because the brain forms and refines memory tracks both during and between training sessions. So while people are training, and also with sleep and rest, and as they come to the next training session, changes at a neural level take place. And there are many strategies that we can use to optimize this process. And the choice of the way in which we design training sessions can take this into account and be tailored to the individual. So, for example, not everybody's going to benefit from verbal feedback, and not everybody is good at imitating other people. And this may have a neural basis, and also a basis that's related to their stage in development. So, for example, children who are much younger, for example, a 2-year-old, they're not so good at observational learning. They can certainly grossly copy behavior, but copying it at a refined level of detail they tend to be less successful. But at later ages, between 11 and 12, they can be very effective observational learners. All of these learning principles, as we've learned in this course, if you recall back to, for example, lectures on control-based learning theory, each one of these learning theories and principles, have a basis, a neural basis. So things like focus of attention, modeling, implicit, explicit learning, they involve specific brain systems or brain regions. And for example, a child's brain works less efficiently than an adult's brain, and so solving a simple sum it does take longer for a 7-year-old compared to an adult, because certain brain regions are needed to solve the sum, and they work more slowly. And so more complex instructions that require working memory can be problematic, and so the trainer or a coach should avoid relying on these or using these during training. So I'll give an example of what I mean by this. So we have a girl working with her mother.
Okay, so the first thing in the cartwheel module that we're going to work on is learning how to do a cartwheel. Now, we have one of these cartwheel mats we teach kids. This works really good for 3- and 4-year-olds. If you don't have a mat like this, don't worry. I'm going to show you some modifications. Tati's going to help me. She's going to start standing on the footprints. And the nice thing about this, it's even right or left. So I already know that she prefers her right foot in front. So she's going to start on this side, put her hands on the handprints, and do a very little hop to the other side. Now, so she can do a cartwheel. She kicked really high. Can you start on this side and just do a little cartwheel? Put your hands on the handprints and kick around. So at first, the cartwheel is going to probably look a little bit more like this. And that's okay. That's what we're looking for. If you don't have a mat like this, what you can do is we can use numbers, inputs, or circles. And you can use sidewalk chalk and draw on the floor. Anything to give them a visual. And you're not going to want it in a line. You're going to want it set up like this a little bit. So Tati, if you start with your 1 foot in front, put 1 foot on the 1, and her hands are going to go on the 2 and the 3, and then she's going to try to land over on the 4. She has a very good cartwheel, so that's what we're working on progressing to. Can you show me what your cartwheel looked like when you were learning? At first, their cartwheel's right here, sweetie. The cartwheel's going to look really small with bent legs, and that's okay. And a lot of times they're going to land with 2 feet at the same time. That's all right to start with. The important thing is you're going to have to try to figure out which foot goes in front. Normally, it doesn't matter if they're right-handed or left-handed. We get 50-50. So what you're going to want to do is first ask them, like, which foot do you prefer to kick a soccer ball with? Okay, she says right. And knowing her, she's correct. Some kids are going to naturally say right, but you're going to want to try them from both sides regardless. The next thing you want to make sure is once you know which foot is their dominant foot to tumble with, not necessarily their dominant foot, is to make sure that they know that the same hand and the same foot go down first. So she makes sure that the right hand is the hand that's going down at first. You will see some kids are going to naturally want to switch and cartwheel this way. And if that's the case, you could put a hair tie on one wrist or put a stamp on the hand and remind them that's the first hand that goes down. Okay, so another way, without using the numbers, you can also...
So I like all of these strategies that she's referring to help the child simplify the cognitive burden. And it's also interesting with this kid's, I would assume it's her daughter, she's already struggling to follow her instructions precisely, and there's different reasons for this. What she's putting her attention on, and so on and so forth, is something that is influencing the way in which she's able to take in information or follow the constraints of her mum. And there's a final step here, which is interesting. It's an interesting technique as well in terms of using these hand pads to modify the difficulty of the task, which is quite nice. So
they'd start on the red side. The nice thing with this is as they're learning, you can modify it. So do a nice little cartwheel like when you were younger and learning. Okay. Now that her cartwheel is getting a lot better, I can start stretching them out. So the next progression will be to try to get your cartwheel more in a straight line and lengthen it. Go ahead. Nice. And then the next progression, once you see that they're going hand, hand, foot, foot, is we're going to try to get it even straighter in a line. Try again, Tatiana. And you're going to want to start inching this foot, the first foot that lands in, so that this foot is landing as close to their hands as possible. Very good. Another way to do this is to use a line. Now, if you have masking tape, you can put masking tape.
Okay, perfect. I'll stop it there. Okay. So brain development also influences interpersonal skills and long-term, short-term goals, and our individuals' ability to plan in the long term with the long term in mind. And so with young people, they can only handle a certain amount of independence, and part of this is based on the maturation of the prefrontal cortex. It's believed to be complete roughly around the age of 25. So if you're dealing with adolescents, this part of the brain is still developing. I would assume that many of you in this course are still developing this region as well. So for this reason, adolescents can't make difficult decisions or calculate consequences and balance possibilities and perspectives. And they benefit tremendously for this reason from adults in their late 20s for motivation, inspiration, support, and guidance. But that's not to say that they shouldn't discover the world and gain experience, but there should be some sort of, ideally, a framework or a support network that helps guide them in some manner. Executive development begins roughly around 6 years, and these functions don't develop simultaneously. So functions such as inhibition might improve from years 7 to 13, and from 12 years old, goal-orientated behavior such as taking the initiative in what they want to train happens a bit later. And finally, this developing a sense of socially desirable behavior also happens around after 12 years old. And teenagers, on the other hand, will start to go through phases where they want to detach and away from their parents, and parents become a source of embarrassment. And in part, this phase going from 14 through 17, it's also called the conformist phase. It's where young people become much more socially sensitive. I guess counterintuitively, they're pushing away from their family, and it might seem as a rebellious thing, but in part, it's also that they want to be part of a group and with an established set of norms. And again, if you reflect on it, it's quite a functional, important part of development. And to challenge your parents' rules, etc., I can imagine must be an important functional thing for people to go through. But of course, the importance of having a support network and a framework that helps guide them is going to be important as well, because we all imagine, probably many of us have also experienced what can happen when you make decisions which perhaps later you might feel that, or you might feel glad that there was indeed a support network around to support you to address some of the negative consequences of maybe less desirable decisions. Movement also influences cognitive development and our ability to learn. And the reason I talk about this is because what we do as kids and as we're developing influences our cognitive capabilities later on. So there's a codependent relationship between our behavior and our actions and our development as well. So it's hard to know exactly how movement leads to better performance and cognitive functions such as inhibition, planning, attention, but there are certainly a range of studies that have shown physical activity influences our hormones and also our cognitive capabilities. And there's also indications that movements lead to the formation of new blood vessels, creation of new neurons as well. And more recently, we start to see studies that reveal or are showing that having exercise bouts interspersed with in education, so to break up a class session, influences and can improve attention. So this data here shows 4 different groups during primary school. In primary school, kids who were given nothing, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or 20 minutes of exercise every hour in the classroom, and their percentage of on-task behavior during the lesson was observed, and it seemed that was a sort of a optimal of 10 minutes every 1 hour of exercise helped improve the ability to maintain attention on cognitive tasks, so learning math. Another important individual constraint is perhaps a more obvious one related to height. So, and I'm going to talk about, and this is also coincides or is related to puberty onset. So there's a difference between calendar age and biological age, and these can be quite different during adolescence and because of variation in puberty onset. And you might come across this term in your studies called peak height velocity, and this is a period of time when a child experiences the largest increase in growth. So it's a growth spurt, coincides with puberty. It's not typically the period of time when children experience the most growth is from ages 0 to 2, but we're talking about after that period. So from between the ages of 10 and 16, there tends to be a increase in the velocity at some point that their stature increases. And this is what I'm talking about, the peak height velocity there. So accelerated growth, when this happens, accelerated growth can disturb coordination, influence movement economy. And so there's going to be an impact, a negative impact on performance during this period. And we need to be careful about increased risk of injury during this period. Also, frequent peak forces, jumping, landing, frequent torsion movements, as well as static stretching should be avoided in this period. And this is because of weaknesses in the cartilage between at the end points of our joints, as well as the integrity of our tendons at the point at which they join to the bone. So I've talked about variation in growth broadly across individuals. So as from ages 6 through to 20, there's variation across that period of time in how quickly people grow. There's also variation between individuals, and we can identify early, average, and late maturers if we look between individuals. And late maturing individuals, and we've represented this here in this bottom graph, where the height velocity in the y-axis against age we have different lines here, and so we have an early or precocious developer. We have an average developer here with this dash with the black line, and the long dashed line is a late developer, and the average development is this small dashed line here. So late maturing children can have to find ways to cope with the different physical constraints relative to other people who have developed a bit earlier. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because late maturing children actually have a disadvantage. And this disadvantage is something we should be aware of and try to, despite this disadvantage, facilitate their involvement in sport and physical activity as much as possible, taking into account that there's variation across individuals during these periods. And there is some research and speculation that late maturing children, because of their disadvantage, they have to develop different ways of competing with other children of the same chronological age. So can help make them better problem solvers, more resilient in competition with their peers. But it should also be, we should always be conscious of these constraints and making sure we're as inclusive as possible with kids around this age. There's going to be physical pressure of more mature opponents that can lead to rapid skill adaptations in these individuals. And it's also been found that late maturing football players appear to also receive higher salaries and achieve a higher level of professional performance. So there is a kind of there is some evidence that the individuals who can somehow survive even despite in face of their disadvantage, and perhaps because of their disadvantage, their level later on is elevated because of this. Okay, so I'm now going to go through the environmental constraints on development, and a lot of these constraints have been determined again through retrospective research. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail with these, but you should be aware of the ones which we're aware of that influence and athletes that influence our athletes' ability to achieve high levels of performance. And I guess I don't want to make the point that you need to have these constraints in place in order to achieve a high level of performance, but the fact that there is a tendency or a trend for these to influence a reasonable proportion of high level athletes is interesting, because it reveals there's some sort of mechanism at play that we want to try to facilitate and encourage, irrespective of the social economic conditions that we might be ourselves working under. So the first environmental constraint I'll mention here is the average birthplace population size. So this is sometimes called the Wagga Wagga effect in Australia. So it's the phenomena that elite athletes tend to come from smaller towns, and so not from the city centres. And there are different reasons why they think that this might be the case. The nature of the community, the support networks in place, the fact that when you do sport or you do physical activity, you're doing it with a broad variety of individuals. So you don't just train with people that are your age. You also have to train with people who are older than you, and you have to deal with that and adversity and so on. There's also, in this slide, I also want to mention the role of family. So the family also plays an important role in an athlete's degree of success and the degree of involvement that they have, as well as the family's background. So I'll start. I think a nice or a classic example is Tiger Woods. So let's have a look at this video and just want you to reflect on his father's had a strong impact, or is known to have a strong impact on Tiger Woods' development.
This is Eldrick Tiger Woods, and Eldrick is an accomplished golfer. He wins tournaments on a regular basis and has shot close to par on 18-hole courses. Incredibly, Tiger here is only 5 years old.
On the tee, we have the 9 o'clock starting group, the youngest contestant ever. He's 5 years old. Eldrick Tiger Woods.
On a golf course, Tiger has the kind of poise and confidence that would be the envy of most golfers 10 times his age. His knowledge of the game is truly amazing.
Tiger has an overall concept of strategy right now. I pointed him down the left side of the fairway as an overall concept. Then he implemented that concept repeatedly right down the fairway. And as we approached the hole, which he had never played before, we made slight adjustments. But he followed the concept. When he wants to hit something, he hits it where he wants to hit it, not only where, but how he wants to hit it. Okay, you gonna make a par on the last hole? Uh-huh. Okay, all right, let's go do it. Well, when he was about 6 months old, I had this putter cut down, and I gave it to him as a toy. And he had dragged this thing around all over the house. And I worked out in the garage. How's that, Tiger? Boo-boo? Sure was, wasn't it? When he was 11 months old, I took a break, and he walked right over, picked up his little putter, set up just like I did, looked at the net as his target, took the club back, and hit the ball right in the center of the net. At 11 months old. At age 2, I took him out on a course, and he played a regulation course, 9 holes, which is par 36, and he shot a 48. But he entered his first tournament, which was a pitch, putt, and drive tournament. And he was competing in the age category of 10 and under. And at 3, he won it. Parents should be supportive. We can't dictate to him what he can be and what he cannot be. So as a consequence, what we do is we participate with him in golf, And if it was bowling, we would participate with him in bowling. And each and every one of us has our own life to live. And he has a choice to live his life the way he wants to live his life.
There's a lot of living ahead for Tiger. He hasn't even started school yet. That leaves a lot of time to share with his family. Maybe that's one reason why Tiger is more than just an amazing golfer.
He's just an exceptional person. Golfer and...
Stop it there. So a pretty incredible story, actually. And the role that Tiger's family played clearly was pivotal and crucial for him in developing a love and passion for playing this game, and certainly the rest is history. And I really invite you to look up this story. I've also put a documentary up on the additional resources section, which I think is fascinating as well. Another example of important environmental constraints are coaches. So coaches play a critical role in an athlete's development, and the coaches will play an important role throughout an athlete's development. And the key with coaches is that they should be adapted to the skill level of the player. So if a player has plateaued and they're not improving, it might be time for the coach and player to break company, and the player should seek out a coach who can help elevate them to a higher level. And part of this, the reason why coaches are so important is that they're able to, a good coach will adapt to the learner's current level and find a way to bring them up, to present challenges to them that are relevant, to support their learning. And I think a really nice example is Eddie Jones. So let's have a look at, I think it's some great dialogue from some rugby players reflecting on Eddie Jones's influence on them as professional rugby players when they were younger in their 20s. So there's a bit of foul language in this one.
Against England, at the time, Eddie Jones had a system for your plus and minus. A good pass plus, missed tackle minus, good kick, bad kick, whatever. I'm the only player to finish in the minuses. I think after 10 minutes I was -4 or something. Yeah, I think that was kind of the big wake-up call for me when I got my first test. I was like, shit, like, this isn't my level. Like, I'm not at this level yet. And as soon as the tour finished, most players get a holiday, but Eddie sent me straight back to Super Rugby. So then I had to sign for the Brumbies because I was in Canberra, and yeah, I was just lucky that I was in a good team.
Did you have with Eddie? Was it old Eddie? Because there's like you talk about like the rebrand. Because obviously there's like old Eddie, there's like ruthless, like stink eye, will fucking kill you Eddie, and then there's the new Eddie that we see when he doesn't kill anyone. Did you have? Oh, was that old Eddie?
I see Eddie in Suntory. He'll come to Suntory when I was there. I still get old Eddie. He sees me as that 19-year-old. Gents, how are you, mate? And I'm just like, shit, how do I feel? Do I feel good? Do I feel bad? I don't know how I feel.
Because you said,
is it?
if you said to you went, Gents, how are you, mate? You went, oh, I'm a bit tired. What the fuck's wrong with you, mate? You're tired, mate. Tired, mate. You know what tired people. Go home if you're tired.
Yeah. And if you say, I feel good, you're not training hard enough, mate. You're like, fuck. What do I do? Yeah,
Do you do quite a good impression of Eddie? Can you give us a spin on that?
Oh, I've been known to do not a bad Eddie.
Have you ever used it in a broader context beyond just an ale around a fire pit?
Yeah, well, I did one for Rugby Pass about my 21st when he was telling me, so he pulled me aside and he said, Gets, I know it's your 21st, mate, but you're not to drink. We're in the middle of World Cup prep. And I said, yep, no worries, like, I don't care, like, I don't want to drink. Doesn't worry me, like, I'm here for the team. And then they put on a big cake and a big do that night. And the boys come and said, you want a beer? I said, no, it's all right, like, we're going to train tomorrow. He goes, Gets, have a beer, mate. You're with your friends, mate, relax. So I'm just going, what do I do here? Like, he just told me in training not to have a beer. I said, look, no, it's fine. Like, I won't have a beer. And then he said, get him a beer, mate. He'll have a beer. So he got me a beer, put it down in front of me, and I was like, what am I doing? Is this fucking terrible? But he would constantly, like, just use that stuff, like, always with me. Like, at training, Gibbs, fucking nice pass, mate. Great pass. But then as soon as everyone would leave, he said, go work on your tackling, mate. Not good enough. So, like, everyone would think I'm this pin-up boy. But he would ride me, like, all the time. Send me a message. Have you been doing this? Are you doing that? But in front of everyone else, it looked like I was this pin-up boy. So it's still, even now when I see him, even now, like, my heart races when I think about it. Like, if he walked in this room here, I'd stand up and just give him a chair and say, yeah, mate, talk to the boys here.
Unbelievable. Did he get the best out of you by doing that, or do you feel that it's sort of the indecision and the questions sometimes hampered you?
No, definitely. He got the best out of me. Especially as a young age, like, I was still trying to learn the game. He gave so much information. Before this New Zealand test, I didn't even know I did it, but at training, I went forward and then cut across, and it just allowed the defence to chase and Sterling would drift under. He said, that's the line, mate. That's what I want. And I never even thought about it, but going into that game, I just thought about manipulating defenders that way, and it helped our team. Like, he was just really good at the small detail, and when you're a young guy, like, trying to learn the game, he was unreal.
Is that why fed under old age?
I think he loves Husky. He's the only player that I think he said he likes. Is that true?
yeah, he did. I just wonder how Haskell would have fared under old Eddie. I mean, it would have been a 2-minute conversation, wouldn't it?
I had a mate that got called, Matt Henjak, got called up, his first Wallaby selection in the squad. And he said, well done, Matt, you've made the squad. He said, oh, thanks, Champ. He's gone, Champ? Champ? Do you respect anybody, mate? I'll see you in 2 days. When he got there, he didn't last long. He left long. Yeah, I mean, you know, if you're nervous, though, I don't know if you're nervous. Like, I've tried to call him sir. I don't know. When you talk to him, we panic. He's just gone, Champ. He's gone, Champ.
What a fuck up, though. What a fuck up. Like, I'm like, obviously, Eddie's got a few nicknames of us, but you're right. As soon as he comes in, I'm like, this was a joke. Then he said, thanks, so you know, because like, just like you, I get like Hess, mate. Oi, you're looking good, mate. Oi, these guys said you're old as fuck, mate. You're looking good, mate. And then I get a text later going, see Walters, mate. Need to work on your jumping. You can't fucking jump, mate. Or I get a text from something going, mate, you need to go and speak to Dean, mate. We need to speed you up, mate. You're looking like a fucking cart horse out there. And then I go next day and goes, good, mate. Looking faster. I was like, fucking up. It's going to be one session. Honestly, because you wanted to always go and improve. Like, you honestly, I'd be like that. He'd call me, go, Hess, mate. Need to come and see you. Like, how are you? I'd be like, good. He goes, you know, mate, you can do this, you can do that. Do you know how good you can be? This is what you need to do. This is what you need to do. And I'd be like, yes, sir. And he'd like give you the tools to go and do it. And you go and work on it. But it was always like that tendency because I naturally want to like build a relationship. I think it's always important to have like, you know, good relationship with coaches and players, but to never step across that mark. For example, call you a fucking champ, or you know, I give him a little bit of shit, but not too much shit, because you just don't want to accidentally see the, you know, like, oh, mate, are you fucking serious?
So Eddie, that's just a great set of anecdotes, and it's a great story about Eddie Jones and the impact that he had on these players, and he must just be an incredible coach. By the sounds of things, the way he can get these guys motivated and keen to show them his best, show him their best. All right, so the next
It's definitely not
sorry, yeah. So the next have I got this correct? Let me check. Yep, okay. So the next constraint that I want to talk about is something called the relative age effect. So this is an important phenomena, and I think one that really shows the impact of quite a complex range of factors influencing the nature of who gets to end up playing a sport. So the relative age effect, typically children, as kids, they'll be grouped based on their chronological age, so based on what year they're born in. And within these groups, within these age groups, there's differences between these children, biological differences. So some are bigger than others, And so, for example, for grade sixes, kids in grade 6, we're talking about 11-year-olds, and with 11-year-olds, you've got some who are born in January and some who are born in December. And so the ones who are born in December are younger than the ones born in December. The ones who are born in December are much younger, almost by a year, than the ones who were born in January of the same calendar year. So when the ones born in December and January compete against each other in December, if that's when a selection day is, then the ones born in January have a massive advantage because they've had a whole year to develop, and we've already seen how much of this how much growth can occur in a single year, both in terms of cognitive as well as stature. This can provide a significant advantage for those children. And what tends to happen is that those older children, biologically older children, tend to get selected for any situation where a selection event occurs. And this advantage shows up at the adult version of the game. So when people are 25, 30 years old, and you look at what month of the year people are born in, they tend to be born in quartiles or months which have given them an advantage during their adolescent years, during selection periods. So, and the reason why this is different reasons are proposed. So, for example, maybe you get selected when you're 12 and 13 and 14 and 15 on the basis of this relative age effect, and you get access to better coaches, better equipment. You start to feel good about yourself. You enjoy the game because you're successful, etc., etc. And this has constant flow-on effects, so that you tend to continue to participate in the sport, and this ultimately results in a greater number of people who are competing at the sport at a high level because of this advantage. So I'm now going to talk about task constraints. So as I mentioned in the first part of the lecture, if we do retrospective studies, we can look at the practice history of athletes. And the data here I'm presenting is hours of training per year spent either in the main sport of training, so this is for elite and super elite athletes, so practice being activities that are related to the main sport, which are entirely devoted to improvement in performance in that sport, whereas play is for enjoyment. So there's less time spent playing and way more time devoted to improvement in performance. They also, elite and super elite athletes tend to participate in other sports as well, alongside their main sport, with more play devoted in these other sports. There's also quite a significant amount of time spent in physical activity. So these are general physical activity tasks, so it might be running or some strength conditioning, etc., which is away from their main sport. And this is a important finding that I want to emphasize, because it shows that we're looking at roughly 1/3 of the athlete's time. It shows that and suggests that it's very much worthwhile to consider taking an integrative approach where you combine both skills and athlete development in how you approach improving someone over time for high-level sport performance. So let's look at some of these factors, task-related factors that improve skill and athlete development. So I'll start with the idea of specialization. So if we can delay specialization, although I have mentioned that early engagement, trying to build a love for the game early on is certainly worthwhile. If we can encourage a delay in when athletes devote most, if not all, of their attention to a target sport, by encouraging, we are able to encourage multi and donor sport participation or unstructured practice during their younger years, and this can help enhance creativity and independence. So I've got some nice videos that exemplify this. Let's have a look at this first one here. And this is an interview with Joey Peters about soccer.
But why have we taken the fun out of football, Joe? What do you feel and what have you identified as the real critical turning point in world football, or particularly here in Australia, where we started to move away from that free-flowing style and letting the kids enjoy themselves to a more structured, very intense environment?
I think coaching is the main reason there. And look, it was good with good intention. And coaching is always with a good intention of wanting to help. That's the first thing. So we've got well-intentioned people wanting to help. When we brought in the national curriculum particularly, it really focused on, and even our mantra is still better coaches, better players, better football. So we're relying very heavily on these coaches knowing the game, having a lot of knowledge of the game, but also then being able to teach it. And we're relying a lot on teaching. And that, again, is whether it's in the school classroom, we value that over in the playgrounds, which, again, this street football is. It's in the playgrounds, it's in the backyards in Australia. In Brazil, they don't have, or they do now actually have coaches, and they're actually attributing their demise in world football due to all these structured academies and coaches coming in, and they're losing that sense of freedom and flair and creativity that street football and futsal, the small-sided game, brings. So, we've been well-intentioned in wanting to educate our coaches, but in doing so, we're now perpetuating this concept of that we need to teach them to then learn. But if we can actually flip that on its head and say, how do kids learn? Well, actually, how much more powerful is it to learn it on your own in a safe place to explore, to make mistakes, to try tricks, to not have someone saying, no, stop, stand still, this is where you need to be, this is how you need to hit the ball. We've just gone way too structured, and that's where we're seeing, unfortunately, robots. We're seeing too few creative players, not enough Daniel Arzanis. This is the obsession with the coaching, and coaching then goes into where they're starting to have that obsession of coaching teams. So our team needs to win. So then you start putting on your best players, and you start winning at all costs. You pick the bigger players over the smaller ones, and we're not looking after the individual. So what happens to the smaller kids, the Spanish Iniestas, the Messis? They get benched. They don't come through the Australian system because we're looking at the bigger kids who are faster. We've got big fields, we've got big numbers, so we need big athletes to play well, to get the win. That's where I say we need to experience. We need to value the experience so much more than the scoreline. If you can forget the scoreline for a second and actually build an amazing experience, which comes back to the joy of playing the game on the street when no one's watching and it's just there to enjoy. That's where I love the value of street football in a community sense, but also in a development sense.
Yeah, it's really, really powerful words from Joey, and it also links back nicely to this issue of the relative age effect and what happens when you start to try to professionalize things so early on. It's so unnecessary as well. All right, so the other one I want to show is a clip about growing up and the loss of play.
Come in for dinner and then go right back out again until it's dark.
Oh, no. That doesn't happen anymore. The kids now don't go out to play. They go and play date. Can you imagine?
To a lot of people nowadays, just letting your child go to the park with an old baseball bat, a ball, and a glove, and a couple of friends isn't good enough anymore. It just simply isn't good enough. He's got to be in a baseball clinic with a certified coach and a brand new bat, and a brand new ball, and a brand new glove, and a uniform.
Unstructured and unsupervised play for the sake of play has disappeared.
People don't understand the value of play, and that is a very serious problem that will have very serious consequences.
Streets that once hummed with the sounds of kids playing road hockey or skipping on the sidewalk are now eerily quiet.
And that is the simple, magical, soaring pleasure of being a child at play. Because that has been almost edited out of the modern experience. We see free play now, and we regard it as either dangerous, or we see it as a waste of time, because it can't be measured.
What happens when kids play freely is hard to measure, and therefore easy to dismiss. Although studies have linked it to everything from literacy and creativity to social conduct and mental health, much of that research, critics argue, is not definitive because it's been based simply on watching kids play. But recently, new hard science has emerged that provides a clear link between play and our survival.
Survival is really all about adaptability, and that's what play is. Play makes you nimble and adaptable, and that really is the biggest survival skill of all.
Yeah, so great set of dialogue about the importance of play and the role of play in facilitating adaptability during development. So the next idea I'm going to talk about is this concept of multi-sport and the role of doing other sports during your development, during an athlete's development, and the way in which by doing so can help you in your main sport that you may end up that ends up as your target sport. So this concept of a multi-sport is that before children would choose a target sport, they experience various other sports, and this is what we can also call early diversification. So with multi-sport in this athletic skills model, it describes multi-sports as sports and activities that seem to have little or no relation to the target sport. They're considered crucial for fundamental this multilateral development and leads to fewer injuries, longer athletic careers, less dropouts, increased physical fitness, and more variation, both mentally and physically. And I've put a quote here to represent this idea of doing a sport that's unrelated and yet has these sort of complex effects that not just physical but also mental in terms of supporting. So this is Jordan Spieth, a professional golf player. He argues against focusing on only one sport before teenage years. And he gives an anecdote that until he was 12 or 13 years old, he played baseball more than he did golf. And as a result of he also played football and basketball. And he learned how to be a teammate, learning to fall in love with golf as an athlete who plays golf versus being a golfer who tries to be an athlete. So, and the figure here on the bottom, this graph is just showing elite, super elite athletes show that they play other sports during their calendar years. So concurrently while they're training their main sport, they also play other sports as well. Now, I want to give an example of, a sport which you would think wouldn't help in soccer, but the idea that long jump could help someone in soccer is. I've got an example from of Ronaldo using what looks like to be long jump. That's amazing. Okay, so the next idea I want to talk about is donor sports. So, in the ASM athletic skills model, it describes donor sports as sports that have partly or mostly the same basic movement skills as the target sport. And so when I'm talking about basic movement skills, we're talking about various motor skills that are considered fundamental to performance of complex integrated movement patterns. So we're not talking about actions that happen independent of context. These are actions that that we can associate with complex sport-specific contexts. So they might include things like, and this is the list of basic movement skills that we're talking about. We're talking about balancing and falling, romping and fighting, moving and locomotion, jumping, landing, rolling, tumbling, turning, throwing, catching, hitting, aiming, kicking, shooting and aiming, climbing and scrambling, swinging, and music in motion, so moving with rhythm. And each sport, you'll be able to identify its own list of donor and multi-sports with, as well as each athlete's background having these. And I've given the example here of hitting in tennis. So these are a range of donor sports that involve throwing, catching, hitting, and aiming. And this bottom figure here shows the age at which elite, super elite athletes are specializing and deciding that they want to now excel at a particular sport. And the ages tend to be on average around sort of 20 years old. So it's quite late in the game that athletes start to specialize. And the reason I put this figure up is to show that there's a lot of scope to be using multi-sport and donor sport all the way from 6 all the way through to 20 years old, for example, before an athlete fully devotes themselves. All right, so let's check our understanding. Take a 5-minute break and reflect on this question. If you want to be an expert, does it matter if or when you specialize, and why? I'll see you in a bit. Okay, so to finish up the lecture, we're going to talk on the mitigation of relative age effect and go through each of the steps in ASM, in the ASM model. So for mitigating the relative age effect, we don't really have many techniques that are available to us that work. So far, this has been known, relative age effect, so the effect where individuals who are older get selected more frequently, and there tend to be more people who are born earlier in the calendar year in sports that have selections and cutoffs during the adolescent or younger phases of the game. And this bias in the month at which you're born carries on all the way through to adult versions of the game. And so the most common technique that's used to try to mitigate relative age effect is to use education. So you teach coaches, scouts, parents, etc. about the relative age effect, that it occurs, and sporting organisations and institutes like this, because it means they don't actually have to do anything. Because, of course, the reason why relative age effect occurs is in large part because of systematic ways in which the sport is organised. And it's too difficult to change the way in which they organise sport. So, for example, you would have to completely alter how competition is is done at younger ages, maybe abolish competition entirely so that there's no incentive at all to select people based on biological age, and in that way de-emphasize participation for the sake of participation. So that's probably not going to happen. So other alternative ways need to be found, and typically ones which don't require some sort of systematic or costly intervention. And the best one that's been found so far has been one that was uncovered by Dave Mann in 2017. And what they did was they had 3 experiments. One where they had three experiments, 3 groups of scouts who were observing video footage, and they had to rate the players that they wanted to choose. If they were going to choose these players for for selection on the basis of watching games and watching them perform. Now, the no-aged group were groups where the scouts had no idea about the age of the players that they were observing. So they didn't know what the relative age was of the kids they're watching. And there's a measurable selection bias towards older children in the no-age group. And the same was true for scouts when they had the player numbers, so the jersey number plus the actual age of the kids. So they knew on a piece of paper which child was older and which child was younger. And yet the selection bias was maintained with this group. There was a slight reduction on average, but this was not significant. It wasn't until the researchers put the T-shirt number of the children's based on the age of the children. So the youngest child would get number 1, the oldest child would get number 11, playing soccer, and the in-between was all ordered by relative age of the children. And when the information about how old the children were relative to one another was available concurrently, so while they're watching the game, the selection bias where they would tend to choose the older children was completely taken away. So this is a very simple technique for mitigating relative age effect. And I think it's actually got a lot of complex, interesting issues related to it. So I'm very curious about, be very curious to look into some of the impacts of making all of the children aware of each other's relative age. Not only the children, but the parents and the spectators and the coaches. I think that this is quite a powerful technique and really worthy of future investigation. Okay, so now I'm going to finish up by going through the athletic skills model, relating each stage that this model identifies, and talking about the different features of this stage, and giving some examples in how training can be designed around each of these ages and stages. So, as a reminder, the athletic skills model, it argues there are 5 phases of the athlete, beginning with the basic and going through to the elite level. And at each age grouping, there's differences in how we want to approach training. And as a starting point, they suggest that for basic athletic skills, at this phase of the individual's development, so for instance, between 6 to 9 for children, or 5 to 9 for boys, and 5 to 7 for girls, they would be participating in a lot of deliberate play. So activities would be mainly unstructured, child-centered, for enjoyment, and practice activities aimed at improving performance would be more around the 25% of the time spent in those sorts of more structured activities. And then once they get to an advanced athletic skills stage, you get to roughly 50-50, reaching that point at the transition athletic skills until you start to specialize, and roughly at about sort of 80% of the time being spent in deliberate practice trying to improve performance by the time the individual is at the elite athlete stage. So in the first stage, basic athletic skills, talking children between 5 to 9 years old. In this stage, there's clear improvement in motor behavior can be observed. So children will improve rapidly, especially in terms of coordination, posture, balance. All of these underpinning learning of more specific sports skills in the stages following this one. So if the child is involved in organised sport, what will happen, if this is the case, is the organised sport will tend to focus primarily on sport-specific aspects of skill, as well as game tactics. So coaches will be trying to get children to start to strategically follow the rules of the game. So if they're playing soccer, they'll be trying to get them to stop running around only after the ball and spread out and play zonal tactics. So as a result, these fundamental motor skills that are important for development and that occur as a consequence of free play and doing the things that elicit a lot of enjoyment are not really going to be the key goal of these sorts of sessions. Unless, of course, you've got a coach with that mindset. And so it's important to look for sports and activities that can facilitate this. And it might be through doing multi-sport or donor sport-like tasks and finding ways to promote fun and enjoyment. And you might see lots of activities during warm-ups and that sort of thing which allow children to practice these more fundamental motor skills. And ideally with where enjoyment is embedded into the task. And so the sort of tasks or sport activities you should be able to think of yourself, which might encourage practicing balancing, falling, moving, locomotion, rolling, tumbling, turning, aiming, climbing, scrambling, and rhythmic actions with music. There's plenty of tasks and sports that you could think of that can help train these things. The next stage is the advanced athletic skills. So this is boys and girls between 8 to 12 years old. And this stage is often called the golden age. It's where children are able to learn much quicker than later ages, where they'll start to plateau and need to devote more time to gain improvement. And in this stage, movements are more easily copied, so a lot of observational learning can be used. And kids will also start to idolize other particular athletes and people that they look up to. And so this can be done in a fun manner and support learning in that way. And one of the reasons why it's seen as a stage that lends itself to copying is the body proportions are quote unquote normal. So they're the body proportions are sort of proportionate to an adult, and there's not differences in the rate of growth of different limb segments relative to one another, which can happen during the growth spurt. And so you want to start to encourage, again, participation in sports, perhaps more complex activities that enable children to have fun, but also learn these various basic movement skills. As we transition for the transition athletic stage, we're talking about children from the ages of 11 through 14, and you'll start to, this is the growth spurt stage, where the main issue is to, again, children will be aiming to, wanting to have them be involved in sport, and they'll start to specialize more. So we'll start to get to more of a 50-50 deliberate practice, deliberate play, involvement in activities. But there just needs to be concern about the fact that they'll be going through a growth spurt now, and this might change their how well they coordinate their movements, and also increase their risk of injury. In the performance athletics stage, this is in the age ranges of 15 through to 18 years. Performance and becomes more important in this stage, and competition can be increasingly emphasized in order to, make training more sport specific, and also start to consider and take on longer term planning into your training sessions. And the final stage is the elite athletic skills. So this is when children are adolescents above 19, they start to specialize and choose the sport that they want to devote their time to, if they want to go in that direction and start and take sport to a higher level. And at this stage, will be highly sport specific. Starting to emphasize training using donor sports. Still, multi-sports can be useful for preventing injury. And in this stage, motivation is going to be important. So keep finding ways to keep training interesting and keep promoting learning and progression is going to be crucial. And the way to achieve that is through constant adaptation of your goals and finding ways to challenge the learner. Okay, so that's everything for the lecture. You can end on asking yourself, reflecting on this question: which is better, to train one sport or multiple sports, and why?